The history of biblical interpretation explores major turning points and figures arguing for the return of pre-modern spiritual reading patterns. The historical critical method, which focuses on detecting authorial intent, as well as literary and social constructions of scripture, has dominated modern biblical studies. Keith Stanglin challenges us to take a large, more spiritual view of this book in his letter, The Letter of Spirit and Biblical Interpretation. He accomplishes this by looking at how scripture has been treated throughout history from the early church to the present. The book is for individuals who want to have a more in-depth interaction with the Bible. Stanglin is aiming to reclaim pre-critical but not naive spiritual hermeneutics. This is something he does in the past. He refers to this as the approach as retrieval theology, which he defines as taking the best in theology, and in this case, the best of biblical interpretation from the past and enabling it to shape our theology and biblical interpretation today, rather than merely copying ancient theology. We can see the early stages of development in this period. The rule of faith emerges as an interpretive guide for the interpretation, as well as determining the bounds of the canon itself. In the first portion of the book, this development was a reaction to Marcion and his limited canon, and it's least in part. The focus of the second chapter shifts to patriotic exegesis, which begins with Orion, and Orion creates the allegorical approach in significance. He didn't invent it, but he took it a step further than the previous users by incorporating it into his scripture reading. He assumed that the text might have several meanings with a spiritual significance extended beyond what is read at the letter level. He was also able to deal with the texts that were tough to apply as a result of this. Orion suggested 3 different biblical interpretations: literal, historical, moral, mystical, and allegorical. He draws a parallel between the body, the soul, and the spirit. Augustine, chapter 4, discusses medieval exegesis, which broadens the spiritual element of interpretation. The literal, the moral, the spiritual, and analogical are 4 types of interpretations according to John Cassian. The quadriga, as this format is known, served as a millennial basic guide. Early modern exegesis in chapter 5 is the type of exegesis that originated at the end of the Middle Ages and lasted until the early days of the Reformation. Luther and others were able to connect with the original languages and translate the scriptures into the vernacular and textual labor. With these excesses of metaphors brought to light by this new attempt, questions regarding the spiritual element of interpretation arose. The spiritual was largely pushed aside with the Reformation, paving the way for the modern exegesis, the historical critical method. That still holds favor today. Stanglin considers current exegesis to be rudimentary, and he wants us to think about how we may recapture previous spiritual forms of interpretation that are faithful to the text, which also goes deeper into the spirit. Part 2 is divided into 2 reconcilable differences and a way forward to go deeper into the spirit. Allegorical and other forms of spiritual interpretation are properly controlled by the letter. A text can't be constructed in ways that aren't supported by the letter. At the same time, the spiritual form places some restrictions on historical critical reading, allowing Christians to use scriptural texts. Stanglin shows us how the 2 might function together in the last chapter, The Way Forward, so that we can understand the original meaning of a book and then move on to the belief, behavior, and hope. That is Cassian and Gregory the Great's quadriga. The process of analyzing an information source, such as document, a person, a speech, or anything else, is used to gather knowledge. Knowledge is known as a source of critique. Soulen and Soulen handbook provides information on many historical publications. The goal of form criticism is to arrange biblical components into literary patterns, such as love poems, parables, sayings, and tales, and to trace each type back to its period of oral transmission. The handbook by Soulen and Soulen uses a form of criticism to organize the many biblical units into stories, one after the other, identifying the chronological period in which they were written. Redaction criticism is a liberal approach to investigating scriptures, establishing conclusions regarding the authorship, historical reliability, and age of composition. This strategy is usually used to debunk the biblical legitimacy. In terms of the handbook, some interpretations believe it will be beneficial to both the pastor and the students. Conclusion, Dr. Brian Russell talks about the historical criticism, specifically targeting source criticism. There are questions about JED, what it means, where it came from, how it connects to interpolation that arise from reading the book. They are all the results of postmodern biblical research. Instead of focusing on the final form of the text and basing all interpreted activities on reading the text as an artifact, scholars begin to gain historical perspectives and begin to explain how certain features, rather than working together in the final form of the text, merge historically through the process of the text formation, the process of examining the world from which the work arose came in the sharp focus. Furthermore, as demonstrated in Soulen and Soulen Handbook of Biblical Criticism, form and redaction critique rebuild the historical environment in which biblical text originated. Stanglin letters establish adequate constraints on spiritual interpretation that take a larger, more spiritual perspective on things. It helps us to show various ways on each person should have a clear grasp of the techniques and be able to apply them to their ideas.